Hey guys, John Paulamy here, Actionable Intelligence. Today is Saturday, February 11th, and this is the weekly market report. The disclaimer, anything that you hear or see on this podcast or video is not investment advice. I am not a financial advisor. I cannot give you individual financial advice. This is for informational and discussion purposes only. Please do your own due diligence. It's your money. It's your responsibility. Okay, so I'm not going to go. I used to deep dive the Cameco quarterly results. I just threw up one of the slides here. They had a pretty good, what I would consider a pretty good quarterly report and conference call. There's nothing much to say except to say that they continue, depending on how you feel about Cameco, some people don't like how they manage things, but they continue to make progress. The business continues to get better. The comments and forward-looking guidance is positive. So I would suggest that you go listen to the conference call and or if you can get a hold of the transcript, read the transcript, and the question and answers are pretty good from the analysts. So, we like to look at the Cameco results, not, from the perspective of it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. So they're going to give you the best analysis of what's going on in the, uranium market. So, this is one of the slides I took from the conference call slide deck. They added 80 million pounds of long-term contracts for uranium, 17,000 kilograms of conversion services, transitioning to tier 1 run rate, Cigar Lake 18 million pounds in 2022, McArthur River Key Lake transition to production, and record UF6 production. So then investments in the nuclear cycle industry, increased ownership of Cigar Lake, and proposed joint acquisition of Westinghouse, the nuclear assets from Westinghouse with Brookfield Renewable. So again, I'm not going to go through all the comments and everything. I feel like it's positive, some of the comments that were made, and there's nothing much to say except for this uranium and nuclear renaissance continues to trundle along and in a positive direction. So I think you just stay invested. Obviously, Cameco and Kazatomprom, you can actually do, discounted cash flow analysis and things like that. These are actual investments because they're actually operating companies that generate revenue, cash flow. As I've stated many, many times before, most people are looking to be in the junior sector, which is a different animal. That's a speculative endeavor. But the comments that we're getting are, from Cameco are that we continue to be positive on the industry going forward. The other thing that Cameco announced was they announced the biggest supply agreement that they ever signed, evidently. It's with the Ukrainian state-owned nuclear agency or operator. I'm a little bit, I don't know. Is Ukraine going to exist as an entity? There's a war going on there. Okay, if you take this from the perspective of, okay, there'll be some type of peace deal and settlement and, going forward, what's going to be the political situation, the economic situation in Ukraine? So, okay, I get that you've signed this deal. It's the biggest deal you've ever signed because obviously Ukraine wants to get away from Russian supplied uranium and fuel for its reactors. And so, but I wouldn't necessarily bank this because we just don't know the outcome of what's going on in the current warfare that's being conducted in Ukraine. Will the government of Ukraine exist in its state in a year from now? What will be the outcome, of the war? And will a new possibly government that comes in, or would that have the possibility of avoiding this and going back to the Russian supply? No one knows. So anyways, it's a pretty big deal if you read the deal in the notes or in the press release. But again, I probably wouldn't have made such a big deal about this like they did. I'm not sure this is going to, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. Nevertheless, here's a chart of Cameco, the stock price over the last 5 years. Obviously, this would be the pandemic low when all stocks were sold off, basically. And you could see that you could have bought at the low. I don't know how many people did. I was buying, the ETFs down here, but so I was getting exposure to it. But basically, the low for this was about $5 a share, and the current share price is about $30 a share. So basically, in basically 3 years, you've got a six-bagger. So you can see it's obviously, done very well. It's trading extremely higher above its 200-week moving average, the 50-week moving average. This is a little concerning here. You want to see higher highs and higher lows. What we've got is lower highs recently, and then we have kind of established a floor that we haven't dropped through. So is this indicative of just taking that pause that we've talked about before, over the last year after this big run up, and then that we're setting the stage for the next move higher? I don't know. I would say that the fundamentals are good, but you basically needed time to digest a 6x move, right? You're up 6x in the largest uranium company. This isn't a junior miner. So for folks to say, the problem, again, as I've stated before, is a lot of people got in around here, and so they don't have the benefit of understanding what was happening in the uranium market back here or back here. And, this is why I say you have to buy things that are out of favor, that have a inflection, and you have to have the weather withal to sit and wait until, the big move happens so you can get paid off. So I don't think this is over with. I think we're obviously going to go higher over the next few years, but we'll see. So Jesse Felder, somebody I follow on Twitter. I also get you can sign up for his, he sends out a weekly email, and it's pretty good. It's free, and he has good information like this that make you think about things. And what he's showing here says the glamour stocks then and now. So you're talking about the dot-com fraud stocks, 1990 to 2002. I don't know how many of you younger folks were around for the dot-com bubble, but it's similar to what we saw over the last few years in the markets that were running up here in the U.S. We had the same thing happen at the dot-com bubble, with a lot of the same justifications about how the internet was going to change the world, blah, 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 which it did, but that doesn't necessarily translate into profits. And it was really kind of the same. I'm not going to go through it. You can read the history of it. It was very frothy. I had to tell the story about the stocks that I was shorting. The shorts were so obvious. I mean, the valuations on like websites. I remember one famous one, pets.com. I like to talk about this. We didn't have like Twitter then, or, Reddit or Discord or any of these things. What we basically had was Yahoo message boards on the finance page. So you could go to the stock chart and then put messages, and people would get on there and give their opinions. And you'd be like, this stock is being valued on how many eyeballs are looking at it. That was the valuation metric. If you have so many eyeballs, because the thought was, okay, well, all these people are coming to these e-commerce sites for pet supplies, for example, and that's going to eventually translate. Somehow the connection was made logically in people's minds that was going to lead to, all the sales and profits. It didn't really happen. And so you would suggest these things, that this was crazy, these valuations, they're being assigned to the eyeballs looking at the website, and, you would get death threats, and people would, it's the same thing you see nowadays. And like I said, there's nothing new under the sun. Human nature doesn't change. So you see the dot-com run up, ran it up 5,000%. You had this blow off peak, and then you had, well, a 90, not 95, whatever it was, 90, 95, 98%. So a lot of these companies just went out of business. And you see the same thing happening now. Today's glamour stocks, you're seeing the same thing, because this is how bubbles always end. I'm not opposed to playing bubbles. You just have to know to get off the train, because what happens is you get so infatuated with you just get caught up in the Mardi Gras atmosphere. I don't know how else to explain it. It's just psychologically, you start making justifications of why these valuations are not a big deal, how transformative these industries are going to be, all kinds of things. You seek out confirmation bias or information sources that back up your claim. And in the meantime, you can go back. It's not just the .com, but every other bubble before it ends the same way. And so this one has popped. And so you still see people justifying why the previous top performers in the previous bubble can come back. That's not how it works. These things are going to get destroyed. They will revalue lower. Many companies will go out of business and disappear. If you're running a business, at some point, you can't just keep issuing stock or borrowing money. You have to actually have revenue that translates into earnings and cash flow. You can't just run losses forever with the idea, well, we have a total addressable market and we'll get there eventually, and use the excuse, this is how Amazon grew and we're the same way. Most companies are not in the Amazon model, okay? They don't have the ability to do that. So that business model, whatever you want to call it, is over, and this is what you see. So I'll keep that in mind if you're playing around with these things and you think, well, we're pulled back enough, corrections enough, I'm going to go long on a lot of these previous stocks that participated in the previous bull market, or whatever you want to call it, glamour stocks, Nifty 50 in the 70s, whatever you want to say it, international stocks in the early 90s. It's the same theme. So just beware of that. And follow Jesse Felder, because this is kind of good stuff you're going to get from him. I found this humorous to a certain extent. Why? Because I used to work at Duke Energy, and I built a lot of these plants that are now being impaired. I don't know the full scope of this. It just says that Duke's going to take a tax impairment on its renewable unit. It says Duke takes $1.3 billion charge on renewable unit it's selling. Duke Energy Corp will take $1.3 billion impairment loss on the sale of its commercial renewable business, which it now expects to close later this year. So I'm not working for them for many years. I don't know what's going on there. I don't talk to people, but I do know they had this big push into it, and I had to listen to I was sitting there listening to this nonsense. All the executives would get up there and renewables, we're going to transform the company, yada, yada, yada. It was all about tax incentives. It was all about capturing the tax credits. And what happened was, I remember going to a dinner in Austin with my manager and some people from the, I don't know, accounting, tax equity folks, development people. And my manager, he was a good guy, but he had the hook in all the way down deep in his throat. He was all in on renewables. He's an ex-fossil fuel guy like me. And, he had the hook in all the way. And they were like, we were talking about all of this. We were talking about the deals that we were working on, that we were getting ready to build, and me being in operations and then transferring to project management. So I was just listening. I'm not, I'm low man on the totem pole. I'm listening to these guys. And so my manager is like, well, we have to operate. And there's like, we're not going to make these investments in, we're going to basically, when the tax incentive runs out, we're selling this stuff. And he was like shocked. Well, why would we do that? Well, because we've lost the majority of the reason why we're building these. And then once we lose that, then, the returns are not sufficient enough for to justify, so they'll sell them. It's kind of like, and he was shocked. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't get his head wrapped around it, because he was more of a power plant guy like me. He wasn't really a finance guy. He was smart enough to understand, but he's like, well, what about, we have this, and everybody was just looking at him like he was crazy. This is about dollars, dude. This has nothing to do with changing the world. Yeah, that's what the executives say to the media. But I'm just like Warren Buffett said. I tell this story to everybody, you know, about what Warren Buffett said. They have a Berkshire Hathaway has a large business in Mid-America Energy. They've built, I don't even know how many megawatts or gigawatts of wind power. It's one of the shareholders at one of the Berkshire meetings asked Warren Buffett, well, why do we build these things? He said, we build them because of the tax credits. If it wasn't for the tax incentives, we wouldn't build them. That's what he said. I didn't say that. There's nothing to read into it. That's why people build these things. You're not going to build these things without the incentives because they don't work without them. And now, you know, Duke that was going to change the world and, you know, do all this wonderful stuff. When I was there, that's what they were talking. That's when Lynn Good first came on, when I had just was getting ready to leave. She was spouting all this stuff, you know. So again, in the titanic struggle between politics and physics, physics always wins. Again, I don't know the particulars. I'm not going to dive into it. I just thought this was interesting from the perspective of what we talk about renewables and the fact that, you know, maybe they didn't run the assets correctly. I don't know. I haven't been there in many, many years, but I just found this slightly amusing. Let's put it that way. So, Royal Dutch Shell's board of directors is being sued over the climate strategy. They're being sued personally now. So this was an article. I'll try to put links to most of these articles if I was able to get the link. Sometimes I sign up for these email distributions and I just get these via an email with no link to the article. But anyways, where I have an article link, I'll, as usual, link to it so that you can review the information for yourself and make sure that I'm not putting a bias on it. So basically, it's an environmental law firm, Client Earth. So there you go. How would you like to work in that office? In its capacity as a shareholder, filed the lawsuit against the British oil majors board at the High Court of England and Wales on Thursday. The lawsuit alleges 11 members of Shell's board are mismanaging climate risk, breaching company law by failing to implement an energy transition strategy that aligns with the landmark 2015 Paris Agreement. Shell's directors are being personally sued for allegedly failing to adequately manage the risks associated with the climate emergency in a first-of-its-kind lawsuit that could have widespread implications for how other companies plan to cut emissions. And here's a quote from the senior lawyer at Client Earth. Shell may be making record profits now due to the turmoil of the global energy market, but the writing is on the wall for fossil fuels long term. I guess he is one of these people that thinks fossil fuels is going away. It's not going away. So we'll have to watch how this lawsuit performs. Why? Because if the people are sued individually, then there will be hesitancy for other people to serve on the board. There will be, you know, this will change people's view in the West. Why would I want to serve on a board of a fossil fuel company and risk being personally sued by nut job environmentalist lawyers? If you read the article, they talk about how these people became a shareholder and they're representing other shareholders. If you don't like the policies of Shell, vote your shares, sell them, just sell them. These are oil and gas companies, okay? Why should they transform themselves into renewable companies that in the end, the returns are not sufficient to justify the existence? You just see Duke selling their business. They were one of the biggest proponents of this nonsense for the last 10 or 15 years. So again, this is another attempt to use lawfare. Most people, if you sat them down and said, in order to meet these climate goals that policymakers are putting forth and that environmental activists are putting forth, means that your wealth has to go down by this much and this many people have to die. Because that's really what it means. You cannot support the current population of the earth without fossil fuels, just from an agricultural perspective. It's that simple. And again, you can read like one of the columnists I read, Manhattan Conservative, is an ex-lawyer in New York City. He writes about this all the time, about all the nut job policies in New York City that they've been implementing in New York State. They're just not going to come to fruition. So fossil fuel use will not go down even if Shell goes away. If you just stranded all of Shell's and all of Total's and all of Eni's, these are the big, Repsol, the big European international fossil, oil and gas companies. If you just put them out of business tomorrow by mandating it, you still have demand for oil products in Europe. You're just going to have to import it. So the problem is that we are allowing a small minority of environmental activists and policymakers that are either being disingenuous or just stupid make policy and play with a machine that they don't understand. Okay, it's like that Mickey Mouse cartoon about the, wizard. He gets Wizard's Apprentice or whatever, Magician's Apprentice, when he gets a hold of the stuff and the whole thing goes off the rails. Or Lucy's Pie Machine, the Pie Factory. I mean, that's what this term. You don't let these people be in charge because they are fanatics, and fanaticism is not a good way to run energy policy. But again, these things will not go through. We will not go away from using fossil fuels. We will not have an energy transition. 2030, 2050 goals will not be met. And it's just going to be how much pain is required for people in the West to endure before they finally wake up and take political action. That's what will happen. So this, of course, as we are speculators, will create tremendous amounts of volatility and opportunity for us to play these things, okay? Because we don't have a rational energy policy, and all this stuff is politicized, and we have all this lawfare going on. So these folks may be in their mind feel like this Paul Benson, maybe he thinks he's doing the right thing. I don't know. I don't know this person, but I'd like to have a conversation. I mean, but I don't respect these people. They're anti-human. They hate human beings. Okay. And again, there's no solution. There's only trade-offs. In order to have the standard of living that we have in the West, it requires a certain amount of energy inputs. And if you can't tell me where the energy inputs are going to come to replace the ones you want to remove, then we can't have a conversation. And you can't tell me wind and solar, because I'm an expert on wind and solar. I build them and I operate them, and they cannot run a modern industrial economy. They are intermittent power sources. I've said this till I'm out of breath. Until they can tell me how they're going to do that, you can't just say batteries, because that's a math problem. Where do you get the materials? You can't talk out of both sides of your mouth, Mr. Benson. You can't say we're going to run the US or Europe on renewables, and we're going to have all this storage when the current technology requires mining that's insufficient to do that. So in the real world, jet fuel demand to increase this year as air travel recovers. This is what we were talking about. A lot of this is going to come from China. But here's what the article says. Jet fuel is set to be the biggest driver of oil demand growth this year, according to the International Energy Agency. Consumption of the fuel is seen rising by 850,000 barrels a day in 2023, accounting for about 45% of growth this year. China plays a big part in the boom, but it's not the only market responsible. While the nation's post-COVID reopening on January 8th prompted a doubling of jet fuel use within a week, data analytics company Kairos also noted strong demand in Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Yeah, I mean, I track some airport operators, companies that operate airports, and we're not even back, even in most places, to post-pandemic levels of air travel. So we're inching up towards them in countries that already opened up. And now with China coming back, you just saw what it said here. It's jet fuel demand doubled within a week. And I think the last time I looked at it, after the New Year's or the Chinese New Year holidays and the people traveling back from their relatives, it's kind of leveling off at about 12,500 flights a day. The pre-pandemic run rate was like closer to 15,000 flights a day. So I expect over time it's going to inch up to that, but we've already seen a big push in demand now as China's reopening. I see no evidence. I don't know what's going on in China. I know people have different opinions, that all these people are dying. I have no idea. China's not going to reverse the policy as far as I can tell at this point. They're going to continue on. And most people in China have decided and are on board that they have to reopen, and they're going to reopen. I've seen little articles here and there, as I've said before, about people, saying that, it's out of control and all these, it very well could be, but they're not going to report that, and they're not going to reverse the policy. I don't see it at this point. So anticipate more demand. It was not just going to be jet fuel, right? So the entire economy is based on inputs, fuel inputs. So as economic activity picks up, and don't forget the fact that I've mentioned before that I don't really hear a lot of people talking about. I like listening to this guy on Twitter, Cross Border Capital, and he was interviewed this week on my website. I put a link to the interview. The guy that runs Cross Border Capital, his name's I forget his name now, but he kind of went into his theories on liquidity and capital flows and how they affect markets. And he was talking specifically, I mean, he's very wonkish. You got to kind of like pay attention. You're not going to grasp everything on the first go through. I mean, the host that was interviewing was totally overwhelmed. She didn't really get everything, but what I found was particularly interesting was the comments around China and the liquidity that they've pumped into their market to really, it's kind of like, he kind of used the term like, when you watch the movie Frankenstein and they pump all that electricity from the lightning into the Frankenstein monster to awaken him. That's kind of the analogy you use. I think it's appropriate. I was listening to some other analysts, and depending on who you want to listen to, there's anywhere from 1.5 to 3 or 4 trillion dollars of equivalent savings and pent up, that the Chinese consumers have. You couple that with close to $300 or $400 billion in equivalent liquidity injections by the People's Bank of China. I think, this is going to be a major impetus into what happens in China this year. The other thing that he talks about, and if you follow him on Twitter, they put a lot of great charts up. I'm trying to get more and more understanding around this whole liquidity flows. Obviously, my interest in this is from the quotes I use from Stan Druckenmiller about liquidity being the primary driver of, equity markets or asset prices. So it pays attention to kind of try to understand this. And what this guy argued at Cross Border Capital was making the argument for was, we've already bottomed. The worldwide tightening cycle has bottomed, and we're already turning upwards with the beginning of the Chinese liquefying. Japan never stopped, obviously. And so we should see, this guy said he tracks 90 central banks, and the tightening cycle has already peaked, and we're going to move to the next reliquefaction cycle. One of the things he said is, like what you see, what's happened recently in commodity prices and Bitcoin prices, these are manifestations of increased liquidity. Bitcoin itself, his argument is totally a liquidity driven asset. So as liquidity increases, you should see the price of Bitcoin go up. And also, an asset like gold remains to be seen. We'll see. I don't fully endorse any analyst's view 100%, but it's worth paying attention to, I think, and taking into consideration, because it's totally contrary to what a lot of folks are saying and are expecting in the US and in Europe this year and into 2024. So I put this up here. People might find this stuff boring, but let me tie this together. It says Spain's Prime Minister says the EU should reindustrialize. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on Monday urged the European Union to reindustrialize to end its reliance on energy, microchips, and food from outside the bloc, and to learn the lessons of shortages provoked by the pandemic and war in Ukraine. Well, that makes sense. I don't disagree with that. Shortages triggered by dependence on countries outside the EU highlighted, quote, a serious threat to the competitiveness of our companies or to the security and welfare of our fellow citizens, unquote. Okay. Now, here's where it goes off the rails. The solution, he added, was to, quote, reindustrialize Europe and recover jobs and strategic capabilities that we should never have lost. The focus would not be on traditional heavy manufacturing, but digitalization or ecological transition. See, this is the problem. It's very easy to solve the problems in Europe, the economic problems, the stagnation, the deindustrialization. But the political will is, and the view of the people there is not conducive to doing that. Deregulate, solve your issue with Russia, turn the gas back on, deal with, you have to make certain policy prescriptions. We know throughout history, as we've seen countries like Singapore, the tiger countries in Southeast Asia in the 90s, a country like the Republic of Georgia, there are certain policy prescriptions. Hong Kong, okay, there's certain things that you do if you want your economy to grow, okay, and to produce. And the policy prescriptions that are in place in Europe are not conducive to that. That's just how it is. The people there don't want that, okay? That they don't vote for that. They don't want to be subject to the market. They want to be protected from the market. It's very simple. You're either believe in free markets or you're a statist. Okay, so we have this quasi system that you do not get, and yet the free market gets blamed for not producing when this guy says the right things at the beginning and then the policy focus is wrong. Okay. What you should do is get government out of everything, and they should create an environment that's conducive to entrepreneurial activity and low regulation and low state interference in sticking their hand in everything. But that's not how it is. Very heavily unionized there. You have old money that's there that does not want to be challenged, does not want to compete. Okay. This is in every country. I mean, there's a lot of, I found this out dealing with some Spanish companies that I've dealt with over the last several years. Yes, they might be publicly traded, but they're completely, if you look at the history of the companies, they are started by old money, family money. And yes, they take the company public as a way to get a valuation on it, but they still hold good chunks of it. Okay. And they are in the managements. They're on the board still. You see the same thing in France. There's a lot of old money type companies, and people, wealthy people and the workers don't want competition. They don't want to compete. So there's state intervention, state protectionism. And then these, a guy like this gets up and says, why is he talking about solar panels? He uses the example. He noted that 1% of solar panels were made in the EU, or 20% of internet storage used by the bloc. Because the reason why you don't produce solar panels in Europe is because it's very, very environmentally damaging. So it's very costly to put the environmental protections in place to manufacture. Plus, labor is very expensive. That's why they manufacture them in the Western province. This polysilicon in the Western province of China run by coal plants. You've seen the satellite images of the coal mine with the huge coal plant and the polysilicon plant right next to it. Out of sight, out of mind, right? That's why, Mr. Sanchez, because if you put all these costs into the price of a solar panel in the US or the EU that you would have to do for all of the protections, which I'm not saying you shouldn't have, you should have, you shouldn't pollute the environment, the solar panels would not be competitive and the solar plants would not be competitive. I mean, these people lack basic economic, they don't understand anything they're talking about most of the time. It's just all platitudes. We need to reindustrialize. Well, the first thing you should do is break away from the US and have peace with Russia and get Nordstream 1 and 2 up and running, because that's where all the cheap gas was coming from for the bloc. How are you going to have an industrial revolution if your fuel inputs are higher than all your competitors like the US? So I'm not going to argue with these people. You can have your own views. People listening to this can debate this with me. Proof's in the pudding. They're not going to manufacture solar panels or internet storage servers in Europe because they're uncompetitive. That's why. No matter how you try to reindustrialize. Same thing in the US. All of this billions of dollars in tax incentives and money that's going to be spent on the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be thrown away, because that's not how you run an economy. There's two ways to interact in the world. Voluntarily, where a buyer and a seller have a voluntary transaction with no outside interference from a third party, or by the government coercing people to do things because they know better. What do you think's most efficient? There's a reason why I brought this up, and I talked about the energy inputs. We're going to get into something controversial now that some people aren't going to like. But feel free to tell me in the comments. So you will recall that a while back that we had a somebody blew up the Nordstream pipelines that brought gas from, well, 3 out of the 4 lines, the way I understand it, that brought gas from Russia to Europe, primarily Germany, with long-term contracts that was price competitive, fairly cheap. As a matter of fact, since then, we know about the whole, since the war started with Russia invading Ukraine, all the sanctions packages, and I'm not going to get into whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You can have your own view on that. The fact remains that if you remove that cheap energy, the large amount of cheap energy, the energy costs in Europe have went up. Even with the recent declines, they're still higher than they are in most other places, okay? And so when you're manufacturing, when you have an economy that requires energy inputs, and that cost goes up, it affects the whole operation. Because should be elementary for folks. And so what we had this week was an article written by an investigative journalist. Guy's 85 years old, Seymour Hersh. This guy's not a blogger. He's not a conspiracy theorist. This guy is a multi-decade investigative journalist that has broken many, many stories, okay? One of the major ones was the reporting he did back in, I think it was the 60s, late 60s. You can look him up on Wikipedia or whatever. He broke a lot of stories. Was the CIA spying on anti-war activists in the US, which precipitated a bunch of congressional hearings, yada, yada, yada. And so he came out this week and he had an article where he says that he had information about the US and a couple of its allies, most notably Norway, were responsible for destroying the Nord Stream pipelines. And I'll put a link to the article. It's on Substack. You can read it. I mean, hardly anybody in the press is talking about it. They're not talking about it in Europe, as far as I know. It's not all over. It's just, this should be front page news. And if you read the article, in my view, the evidence pointed to the United States all along, because Mr. Biden said, even before the war started, that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would not come online, okay? Victoria Nuland said the same thing. She was squirming in her seat. She was so hot and bothered at her recent congressional testimony that she wanted to say, she's like Jack Nicholson in that movie about the Marine Corps with Tom Cruise. She just wanted to say that the U.S. blew up. She almost couldn't stop herself. She almost said it. Okay. A Few Good Men was the name of the movie. If you watch that congressional testimony, or at least the clips. Okay. And so we blew up an ally's pipeline. Now people say, well, it's a Russian pipeline. No. Gazprom owned half of it. The Germans, various German companies own the other half. Plus it was supplying cheap gas to Germany and to other places in Europe. Okay. So here's a few blurbs from the article. You can read it yourself. You can come to any conclusion you like. I have no doubt in my mind that the United States blew it up. President Biden said it was never going to come online. Victoria Nuland said it's a hunk of junk on the sea. That's what she said. Okay. And this goes back, let me go through the blurbs and I'll just give you a quick commentary of why this is important and actionable. The New York Times called it, quote, a mystery, but the United States executed a covert sea operation that was kept secret until now. Asked for comment, a White House spokesperson said in an email, quote, This is false and complete fiction, unquote. She's talking about Mr. Hirsch's article. Tammy Thorpe, a spokesman for the CIA, similarly wrote, quote, this claim is completely false, completely and utterly false, unquote. So I'll take another blurb from the thing. What you need to understand from this article, they were plotting to do this before the war even started. They were plotting to do this before the war even started. They were plotting to do this before the war even started. Biden's decision to sabotage the pipelines came after more than 9 months of highly secret back and forth debate inside Washington's National Security Committee about how to best achieve that goal. For much of the time, the issue was not whether to do the mission, but how to get it done with no covert clue as to who was responsible. Again, this goes back to the Great Game. This goes back to the Eurasian island, okay? Talked about this before. How is this actionable? If it is true, which I think it is probably true, that the United States blew up with, conspiring with Norway, and it's possible now even some people inside the German government, because I don't think Olaf Scholz had a clue about this personally. He's so out to lunch. He's not even talking to Annalena Baerbock now, his foreign minister, because she went off the reservation with these tanks. He wasn't even included. They don't even talk to each other. So I have no doubt that there may be elements inside the German government that were involved in this too. And Scholz was out to lunch. They blew the thing up because the policy of NATO and the United States, the Anglo-American empire hegemon, is, with respect to Europe and respect to its policy towards Russia, is very simple. We've stated it before. Keep Russia out of Europe. Keep the U.S. in Europe, and keep Germany down. Why? The fear is that you would have, I've said this before, German industrial know-how, engineering. I mean, people just don't understand the industrial colossus Germany is. You couple that, and they were moving towards this, okay? More and more over time. Germany and Russia, okay? They've constantly, the Anglo-American hegemon this is one of their worst fears, is to have Russian natural resources, cheap, ubiquitous, easily obtained resources, primarily energy, coupled with German engineering and manufacturing clout. And then, what do you need the U.S. for then? After the pipeline was blown up, I think it was Anthony Blinken said that this represents a tremendous opportunity for the U.S. Yeah, because now people are going to move manufacturing here because the natural gas is cheaper, and we're going to sell them our LNG at a higher price. Yeah, that's why it's beneficial. Plus, we keep them separated. We keep that Eurasian, conglomeration, that island of that common market from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We just put a wedge in that, okay? And somehow that's going to, we can't allow, as you read Zygmunt Brzezinski's book about the Great Game, we cannot allow an emergence of a power on the Eurasian island that can compete or surpass the United States. That's what this is all about. And so what the United States has done is went completely pirate ship. It's completely rogue. If this is true, which it probably is, there should be congressional investigations. There should be an impeachment. And I want to ask Germans that are listening to me, what do you think about this? This is how gelded your government is. One of your primary allies, you're members of NATO, one of your primary allies, the United States, conspiring with other European countries to blow up your primary energy source from Russia. Now, you could say that the sanctions are justified. You can say that, politically, all this stuff's justified. But now we've blown up these pipelines. And now what's Germany supposed to do? How do you feel about that? Do you like that imposed on you by the United States? Now there can't even be a deal. The reason why is because there still was an opportunity to get a deal. Okay, guys, let's get a deal done in Ukraine, and let's turn the gas back on. Now you can't even turn it back on. Now, evidently, these things can be repaired at some point, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the damage. I don't know enough about the metallurgy. I'm not an expert on it. The point being, why am I talking about this? Why is this actionable? Because one of my main thesis going forward is the decline of the American empire. And they're drowning. And when you see somebody drowning, unless you're a trained rescuer, you should stay away from them, because a drowning person is panicking. They will pull you down with them. And that's what we're seeing. Okay. We're running around the world. This is rogue nation stuff, guys. Okay. You don't go around blowing up unannounced your ally's major energy source that's powering your industrial juggernaut and, pretend you didn't do it. But then, basically tell everybody that you did it without telling them. And then how do Germans feel about this? What is your government going to do about this? Well, evidently not. I guess send more tanks to Russia or to Ukraine. And so the rest of the world's looking at this. We have this titanic struggle going along as the Anglo-American empire is in decline. And when empires in decline and other empires or other states are emerging to challenge for that role, for that hegemon, for that place in the, as we've seen throughout history, okay, this can get messy. It's one thing if, when the Spanish lost their empire over time, okay, well, just transition to other European countries, but there weren't nuclear weapons available. Okay, so we're in a state where we have people that are so rogue that they went and destroyed these energy sources, this energy pipeline to an ally without telling them, did it in secret, covert, if you will. What else will they do? I mean, I've told you before that there's people in policymaking places in DC that have written papers about how it's possible to win a nuclear war. And everybody's just sitting here going, well, let's get ready for the Super Bowl. Super Bowl's tomorrow. This isn't front page news. A few people have mentioned it. There should be Biden should be impeached. Those people that were involved in plotting this should be put in jail. Who is running the foreign policy of this country? What is the goal of the foreign policy? To alienate every damn country in the world? If you're sitting there as Pakistan or countries in Africa or India, you're looking at this going, these people have lost their ever-loving mind, talking about the U.S. And so if the overtures come from China and Russia and they say, well, we have to create this multipolar world because we have this rogue state, we have this evil empire, that's what gets trending. So you start thinking to yourself, what should I do? If you're Saudi Arabia and you had a 50-year relationship with the United States, security relationship, why do you think they're moving away from the U.S.? The U.S. cannot be trusted. The U.S. does the international rules-based order that everybody talks about. I agree with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. What is it? Where is it written down? Who made these rules and who agreed to them? Though the international rules-based order is whatever the United States, the Anglo-American empire, decides it is, it decides it's in its best interest. And so this is going to have repercussions. You're not going to recover from this immediately. All 180 countries on the earth are watching this. The Anglo-American hegemon only represents about 15% of the world's population. There's the 85% of the rest of the world that's emerging markets and frontier markets that are growing. And so who are they going to be more apt to seek alliances with, seek trade with, try to get protection from? The United States, that's in decline, that's running around like a crazy person, doing all these wild things, threatening everybody that doesn't do what they want, or Russia and China. I'm not saying that a multipolar world where Russia and China and Iran and these places like that are in an alliance makes for a better world. I have no idea. Okay. But it certainly can see that people are going to be more drawn to that stability, order, a commitment to have win-win outcomes than just having the United States run around, just blow up your infrastructure because it decides that's what it wants to do. And so I think that's going to have repercussions over the years. I mean, you have to get an entire new government in the United States that needs to come in, clean out the FBI, clean out the CIA, clean out the State Department of all these neocons and wackos. But what's the chance of that happening? Not high. Not high. Trump tried it and he didn't get anywhere, and you see what they've done to him. You think DeSantis is going to come in there and fire everybody in the FBI needs to be completely shut down. They have bureaus of criminal apprehension and investigation in each state. What do you need a Federal Bureau of Investigation? You saw the hearings this week, had people working at these social media companies conspiring against the American people. So I'm going to get off the rant. You can read this article. You can come to your own conclusion. My conclusion is that we're an empire in decline, the U.S., and it's at, well, do you even call them allies now? This is why I say countries don't have allies. They have interests. And it was in our interest to make sure that Germany and Russia didn't reconcile. So we blew up the pipeline. I mean, I didn't need this article to tell me that. I knew that all along. I mean, you never have 100% certainty, but who else did it? Russia blew up that pipeline? Come on. And so, of course, they're going to attack Mr. Hirsch. He's not a random blogger or crackpot. He's broken many, many stories over his 4-decade career, 5-decade career that have been just as shattering, okay, and have not been positive for the United States government. I mean, if you're going to sit here and support the U.S. government with all that you know in its history now, they're dragging us to, potential Armageddon here. Okay, this needs to stop. All right, that's my rant. You can hit me up in the show notes. I would really like to hear from German people. If there's Germans that listen to this, how do you feel about this? Do you think that the United States blew up the pipeline? Are you fine with that? That the United States what's next? So I'd really, how gelded is Olaf Scholz? I mean, with Annalena Baerbock, they don't even, like I said, they don't even talk anymore. She's out there making foreign policy without conferring with the chancellor, evidently. I'd like to know if that's true. Is that what's being reported in Germany? Is that what's going on? So more positive nuclear news. I mean, they were kind of heading towards, as we've been reporting on Japan extending the working life of its reactors. You can go to this. I'll put a link to this. I mean, you can translate the article. It doesn't say much more than this. Basically, Japan formally adopts policy to operate nuclear reactors beyond 60 years. Cabinet approved pro-nuclear plan, including building next-gen reactors. Government pivoted on nuclear amid effort to curb dependence on overseas fuel and hit green goals. I mean, if you go back and look to what I was saying from the start of this video series, like 5 years ago, this channel, I always said that Japan would end up here because it has no choice. It's almost 100%, well, pretty much 100% dependent on imports for fuel. And so with global LNG in short supply and high cost, with coal not necessarily being the best alternative, the country simply doesn't have the ability to build all these renewables. Yes, they build renewables there, but if you've been to Japan or lived in Japan, I lived in Japan for 3 years, you will understand that it's a very mountainous country, doesn't have a lot of flat open space. They don't have the ability to just put solar panels and wind farms all over the place. Plus the wind resource isn't that good. And so they were always going to end up here. It just takes time, right? It just takes time for the zeitgeist and the sentiment to shift. And the Japanese being more of a homogenous country with kind of a society that pulls the wagon in the same directions and being a little bit more pragmatic than the chaos we see in the Western democracies, I always knew they were going to end up here. And here's a poll that was taken by the Nikkei. This shows the support for nuclear power. It says majority of Japan supports nuclear restarts for first time in a decade. You can see, and why is that? Oh, even over time, this was opposition was going down. Time heals all wounds, and so we have a clear majority of people now because it's reality again. When physics meets politics, physics wins inevitably. And the same thing will happen eventually in Europe and the United States. Well, maybe not. Maybe we are so morally bankrupt and intellectually corrupted by this insane wokeness that we've adopted that we're not going to change. We're just going to go step off into the abyss and fall. Very possible. I have more optimism than that longer term. It just takes time and it takes pain. And, that's what we'll see in Europe and the US because we don't have a cogent well thought out, rational energy policy that puts the onus on energy security and stability. So again, I've always said that you should curate a Twitter account that you can follow very smart people. This is where I get a lot of my information. I interact with quite a few smart people. There's a lot of smaller accounts that most people don't know about, and you can follow these folks. And it's just unbelievable the amount of top level information that's just freely given by folks. This is one of the accounts I like. It's I can't pronounce this gentleman's last name, but it's at energy_tidbits. He's the chief market strategist at SAF Groups. What I like about it is if you go to the website, you can sign up for this email that they put out every week. It's called Energy Tidbits. You get it like late Saturday, early Sunday morning. I can't remember, on the weekend. It basically summarizes. It's typically 30 pages PDF about all this energy news and stuff that you're not going to. It's all condensed in there. Now you're not going to get stock picks or anything, but like you're going to get all of this information, all this news that's collated, that's being curated for you, and gives you a lot to think about, more than you're going to get if you just peruse Bloomberg, or they're taking in all these inputs plus looking at what traders. I mean, it's really good. I really suggest that you follow this Twitter account and you sign up for the Energy Tidbits email, and you'll get that every week. Top-notch account, and they could charge thousands of dollars for that Energy Tidbits, make it into a newsletter and send it out every week, and people would pay for it, but they don't do that. And this guy only has 7,200 followers. Nobody knows about it, and they give the stuff away for free. So I would follow it. This is something that I've talked about before. I just put this title on the slide: things that make you go, And so you have name changes of companies changing their names. I don't know who any of these companies are. I have no clue. But what I find interesting is that what I've said before, when you can tell when a market is getting near a top, another indicator is that all the moose pasture companies will start changing their focus. I'll give you an example. All these companies like critical metals right now, critical battery metals are the big new thing, right? Everybody wants to get into critical battery metals. And so you have all these companies changing their name, or lithium, lithium, nickel, cobalt, these things. And so you have these companies changing their names, right? Copper Ridge Exploration is now Norris Lithium. Braveheart Resources is now Canadian Critical Minerals. Madi Minerals is now Pegmatite 1 Lithium and Gold. I mean, I don't even know who these companies are. I don't know what they were doing before they got into this. Maybe they were, what moose pasture they have, if they have legitimate properties. Maybe somebody in the comments knows, but this is typically what you see. GME Resources is now Alliance Nickel, because what you want is, right, if something's hot, you want to have the focus brought to your company, right? So that you can do an offering, say, hey, we have this project, we're focused on critical minerals. Here's the total addressable market for batteries between here and 2035. You can see the combined annual growth rate is 35 or 40% a year, blah, blah, blah. And here's this moose pasture that we were drilling for gold on, but we think we have some lithium there. This is how it's done. And then you can keep the game going, because the game is to keep retail investors coming, or keep the money flow going. So again, I don't want to speak negatively about any of these companies because I don't know them, but this is typical of what you will see. This is what happened. Somebody asked me what happened during the last uranium bull market. This is what happens. I mean, when the uranium bull market started, the last one, there was only 2 or 3 publicly traded uranium companies. At the end, there were several hundred. Were there several hundred competent uranium mining teams available staffing these companies? Were there really several hundred or a couple hundred, whatever it was, legitimate uranium projects? No. People just changed their name. It's not just in mining. They do the same thing in other industries. And these things are typically should make your spidey senses go off about, well, how far has lithium really went? I think it's starting to, I've already declared in my mind that we're at peak ESG. We're never going to meet these goals that they're talking about because the resources don't exist. The ability to mine the amount of resources that are needed to do it with the current technology and methodology they're talking about simply doesn't exist. It will not happen. And so maybe we're getting near the top of this. Maybe it plays out. Maybe they pull a rabbit out of their hat and they do it. I don't know. But I just thought this was interesting to bring to your attention because this will apply to when we see near the top of any market, you will see this happen. You will see all these companies change their names, junior mining, because what did they do in Vancouver? I told you this before, junior mining resource companies, okay? This is not for, this is not for people that don't have a strong stomach. They're there to take your money. They're legitimate companies, but not that many. Most of them are lifestyle companies, and this is what they do. And when the ducks quack, ducks being retail investors, quack, 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 lithium, quack, 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 critical battery metals, quack, quack, quack. They have a saying in Vancouver, when the ducks quack, feed them. And that's what they do. They create companies, they change the names, they issue shares, they come out with stories. Again, if you're going to play in this market, go to one of these resource conventions where they have a big hall and they'll have several hundred tables and exhibits for these junior resource companies. And if you go to just pick 10 randomly and go there and say you're interested, and they'll start talking to you and tell you about how wonderful their project is and how it's going to do whatever it's going to do. When we know for a fact that very, very few companies actually ever go from development to an actual mine. That's why you have to know who you're dealing with. Have they done it before? There's a whole bunch of stuff. We've talked about this before. So I don't want to belabor this. I just wanted to bring this tidbit to your information, to your attention. So again, compounding quality, another Twitter account you should find. Outstanding information every day. Every single day, this guy's putting out good information. His website, his Substack, has thousands of pages of PDFs of famous investors' writings, all free. But he puts up these memes too. So I've said this, if you're going to be an investor long term, and you should try to get, a lot of things that I talk about of why people aren't successful financially in investing comes down to one thing. They try to get rich quick. I did the same thing when I was younger. I was jumping around from different schemes and scams and penny stocks and options. It doesn't work. The way that you get wealthy is you get wealthy slow over time. You don't, some people get lucky. I get it. Okay. But the average person, that's not how you do it. And so you have to have a mindset change. And this, I thought, was very illustrative. One of the things you always have to do is pay yourself. You got to build a grub stake. Charlie Munger says that. He talks about a number he had to get to. Now, of course, it's adjusted for inflation, but bear with me. He talks about getting that first 100 grand put together. He's talking about a grub stake. Okay. Now, obviously, I have to find out when he made that statement and adjusted for inflation, but just bear with me. The point is, you got to get that grub stake. And what does he say? You got to do whatever you got to do. If you got to live on beans and, in your mom's basement, you got to get it. Whatever you got to do, you got to get that grub stake. Because once you get that 100 grand or whatever it is now, few hundred grand, then that's the hard part. Then it becomes progressively easier after that. And that is true. That is true. I can vouch for that. You got to struggle. You got to get it. You got to put that grub stake together. And then, but this is what, a lot of folks do. You say a poor person, when they get income, the first thing they do is they take care of their wants and then their expenses. There's no investing or saving going on. And people say, well, John, you don't understand. People are poor. They don't have the ability to do that. Yeah, they do. I mean, I've went through many people's budgets when people used to ask me, and, they're sitting there drinking a Starbucks and with an iPhone in their hand. And they say, I just can't seem to get this, John. Well, I'm in debt. How do I mean, come on, man, have some self-introspection. There's been several stories that I've pointed out of a guy that was a janitor or some person that was a food service worker or something, and they grubbed away. And, the guy lived till he was like 85, this janitor, and nobody really paid attention to him. And when he died, he had a portfolio of several $1,000,000, and he made all these donations to the local library and to the hospital. It can be done. It's consistent, even if it's $10 a week, even if it's $10 a month to start, you got to do it. Okay. You got to do it because the time is going by. You're wasting that time, and compounding requires time. Okay. And what happens is this is how, and these are generalizations. I understand this isn't every person. I get that. So a middle-class person, they get their income, they pay their expenses first, then they do their wants. That's what you see most people that you interact with do. Again, no discussion about investing. I talked about the fact that when I was at Duke Energy as a manager, HR called me and I had to give those presentations to the guys because we had I think it was 100%, 5% match, or no, 100% up to 5% on your 401k. So you're getting 5% of your salary, or 6%, I think it even was, 100% match, and half the people weren't participating. They were all in their early 20s. It's like, guys, do you understand how this works? Even if you're not an investor, just, put it in a money market fund. You're getting 100% return every payday when they take the money out. They're matching that amount up to 6% of your salary. Why aren't you taking advantage? You can't put away 6%. Your bills. No, what it is what they want to do. They want to go out. They want to spend money. They want to. I get it. But you got to get that grub stake. Okay, and you're wasting time that you need in those 20s, 30s, and 40s. That's 30 years of compounding right there. By the time you're 50, you could be a millionaire. But this is how rich people think. They get their income, and the first thing they do is think about how much they're going to pull out for their investing, because they understand they're always going to have expenses. Okay, you're always going to have expenses, so that can't be an excuse. You're always going to have bills. And then after they pay themselves and pay their expenses, then they address their wants. So you see the difference. And again, these are generalizations, I know. And some people get lucky, I get it, okay? But for the average person, this is how it applies. You've got to start. You've got to get whatever you got to do. You got to get that initial grub stake together. You got to do it. You got to pay yourself first. Don't make an excuse. Even if it's $1 a week, do something. Get in the habit. Get into the mindset. Don't be like, Jane says, you're going to do it tomorrow, because you won't ever do it tomorrow. Start today. Take the change jug that's been piling up. Go to the store, dump it into the Kroger thing, get your money, start with that $20. Whatever you got to do, do it. Get a part-time job. That's my advice, because if you don't do it, you're just burning daylight. Okay, guys, that's it for this week. Lots of information. Hope this was helpful to you. Again, I'd like to hear from the Germans out there or any other Europeans. Do me a favor, read the article from Seymour Hersh. Tell me what you think. Even if you think it's not possible that the U.S. did that, do you really think that the U.S. has its interests ahead of the people in Europe's interests? What are we trying to do? And then again, I'm interested in hearing this from anybody. How does this situation in Europe, in Ukraine specifically, end? How do we get this to, because eventually it's going to end. So how do we get it there without escalating it or creating more and more death and destruction for the people of Ukraine? Okay. So I'd be interested in hearing those comments. If you want to come at me, you can come at me. I mean, everybody has their opinion. They have their view. It doesn't bother me. I've said this before. So anyways, appreciate the viewership, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.